Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to New York University, Casa, Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to present this new book, Postcolonial Italy, Challenging National Homogeneity. And we have the fortune to have Cristina Lombardi-Diop and Caterina Romeo that are the curator of this book. And to help us with this, we have Professor Teresa Fiore from Montclair State University. And it's also a great pleasure to welcome Teresa back. She was a visiting professor here at New York University. We have very fond memories of her staying, and our students loved her very much. So I'm very grateful for Teresa to have accepted to chair this panel. As you know, our colonial past and our post-colonial past is one of the themes that we tend to analyze in great detail in this department and in this institution. And that's why we were particularly interested in welcoming this new contribution to a better understanding of these issues. These are not easy issues. These are some of the things sometimes that, as a nation, we would prefer not to look back at. And I think this is one very good reason instead to go back to them and study them and understand them and try to not forget and contextualize them without excusing us. And without further ado, I would like to ask Teresa Fiore to come to the podium and present us the speakers and the panel. Teresa is the Inserra Chair in Italian and Italian-American Studies at Montclair State University in New Jersey. Her research interests focus mainly on migration from and to Italy, viewed from a cultural perspective. Her articles on 20th and 21st century Italian literature and cinema and Italian-American culture have appeared both in journals and edited books. A forthcoming essay addressing issues of undocumentedness and citizenship in Italy will appear in a volume published by Cambridge University Press in late 2013. She's currently completing her book, Preoccupied Spaces, Remapping Italy's Immigration and Postcolonialism. Please welcome Teresa Fiore.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefano, for this kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. Always a pleasure to be back to Casa, which is a home to many of us in many different ways. And a home to, I would say, colonial and post-colonial studies in particular, given the interest of many of the members of the faculty here, in particular Ruth Ben-Ghiat and David Forgach, and as a consequence, of course, the content of the curriculum and the cultural programming. So this is a home for, a perfect home for this book, I would say. I will start with a personal anecdote, which I will call a displaced encounter with Italian colonialism. And I'm calling it personal, but in reality, after reading the book, I realized that it's not that personal after all. For many years, I've lived and studied in San Diego, California, a city where the blue taxis are driven by men from Eritrea. An Italian colonial territory, as you know, that was owned by Italy between 1890 and 1941. The taxi driver's memory of Italy back in the 1990s when I was there was still alive, not to mention the remnants of some Italian words. I had arrived in San Diego to study Mexican-American women writers and the complex relationship between Spanish colonialism, American imperialism, on the only border between the so-called first and third worlds, where a most dynamic immigration phenomenon was and is an intrinsic part of the social, cultural, and economic landscape of the area. So in this context, my occasional blue taxi rides and the chats with their Eritrean drivers were sporadic and yet powerful reminders of other forms of imperialism, of colonialism, of migration that I was not attending to, despite my Italian origin, as I can now say, a victim, like many of us, of the amnesia of Italy over its own colonial past, and I would also add over its history of emigration. In the volume that we're going to address tonight, we have an intervention, an essay, a short essay by Robert Young, a prominent scholar of postcolonialism based here at NYU, who had a similar encounter in Washington, D.C., though this time. His casual chat with a Somali taxi driver brought his long-standing study of postcolonialism to a simple place of recognition, improbably related to Italy. Conversely, my chats with Eritrean taxi drivers were the beginning of a new research adventure that left Mexican-American writers on the border of California and has had me questioning Italian borders since then. Cristina Lombardi-Diop's and Caterina Romeo's book Postcolonial Italy rests on this delicate point of tension between personal encounters and collective memories, and fosters the ever-fruitful interrogation of cultural formations, and in particular race formations, as you will hear later, at the intersection of the national and the transnational. So I'm very delighted to be here tonight, to be in their company. They've traveled from very far, from Rome and from Chicago, to present a book that was published last September by Palgrave, and that they have called, with its acronym, PCI. So for those of us, I'm also a contributor to the book, we would get these emails saying, you know, PCI update, and that's also il Partito Comunista Italiano. So it was like un aggiornamento dal Partito Comunista Italiano. So there was like a chill going through our spine. So let me spend a few words about the book and tell you why it is, I think, an important contribution. And I know I'm being terribly partial because I respect the work of these two scholars. I've been part of this project, so bear with me. But I'm really saying something that comes from also a scholarly perspective. This is undoubtedly a groundbreaking contribution to several fields at once. Like any book committed to reading the layered nature of history and culture pertaining to complex issues such as race and national identity, this book has readers, I would say, in four disciplines, namely postcolonial studies, Italian studies, studies of the Southern question, and Mediterranean studies. While colonialism has been the subject, albeit debatedly, of a very large corpus of literature and quite visible by now, and I would have to mention too many names who've been active both in Italy and in the Anglophone world, I would say that the literature on postcolonialism has been equally important, but probably less visible because it's been scattered. And if anything, I'm thinking, for example, of a special issue of Interventions, where it was all collected for the first time. But I think, to my eyes, the edited volume Postcolonial Italy that we're presenting tonight is an important project because it's the first one in the form of a book. And we all know what that means when it's on a bookshelf, when it's you know, in a library, because it offers a comprehensive consideration of the past and present implications of Italian colonialism in historical and cultural terms. This publication is therefore an important contribution, first of all, to postcolonial studies as a field, since it includes Italy for the first time in more visible ways. So by asking the question, how did Italian colonialism work? And with what distinctive characteristics has it informed postcoloniality in this country, the book entertains a relationship with postcolonial studies at large in what I see as a borrowing and giving mechanism, because other colonialisms and postcolonialisms around the world have obviously provided very important interpretative tools to Cristina and Caterina, and at the same time the picture remains incomplete if we don't include Italy, and we'll have a chance to talk about this in particular during the conversation with them. Secondly, this book has redrawn the boundaries of Italian studies. Now, this has been done before. It's an operation that has been going on for a couple of decades, I would say, but one now can rely on a publication that functions as its summa and at the same time an extension of it. One of the merits of the book, I would say, is that it very generously recognizes the work done by scholars in the recent and not too recent past. So for those of you who are moving their first steps in the field. This is your gold mine. And for those of you who are finishing a manuscript, like me, for example, or a dissertation, I am sure that you will find a reference that is still relevant. It's an insightful take on the topic. Also, by attributing equal value to the works of scholars and artists as an entry point into the new ways of being Italian, the co-editors, and I am quoting, relocate colonial memories at the center of the cultural debate, which brings everything to the present. We will address that too, in order to identify both the new forms taken up by power relations and the new epistemologies designed in this post-colonial era. Thirdly and fourthly, as I said before, this book is a very valuable contribution to the studies of the Southern Question and the Mediterranean, as the colonial experience cannot be fully understood without exploring the imbrications of internal migrations from south to north and the inbound and outbound flows of migrations in the liquid basin that connects rather than divides lands and continents. So it is of no surprise that the blurbs on the back cover of the book, and we've made some photocopies actually, so you may actually read those if you have the copies with you, are from scholars from all these different fields, and they all hail the volume as groundbreaking in the words of Ian Chambers, essential in the words of Roberto Dainotto, and provocative in those of Chandra Talpedi Mohanty, for its ability to problematize the suffix post in post-colonial and to show continuities across the historical spectrum. Before presenting the co-editors, I would like to say a couple more personal words, because I really think that this book is the result of one of the most committed acts of scholarly productions that at least I have experienced. And Cristina and Caterina have shown an unwavering attention not only to the content of the book in terms of methodology and theory, but also to orthographic detail with an attention that really shows how they can move from the macro level to the micro level in pretty unique ways. They're devoted and passionate researchers, and I really think it is important for me to share, whose interest for historical, cultural, and theoretical issues is constantly fostered by a political positioning as women, as teachers, and researchers, which I consider an important model for those of us who, while working within academia, see our work as directly addressing social concerns and pressing ones, as in the case of those covered in post-colonial Italy. Through their work as translators, as editors of novels and scholarly volumes, Caterina and Cristina remind us how national homogeneity can be challenged, as the subtitle of the book suggests, at home, in the street, in Parliament, we hope, and in the classroom, as well as in a scholarly volume like the one that has brought so many different contributors together from different parts of the world and from different disciplines, and about which they will talk in a moment. Let me introduce them a little bit more formally. Cristina Lombardi-Diop is a lecturer in women's studies and gender studies and in modern languages and literatures at Loyola University in Chicago. She's editor of Gabriella Germaldi's Regina di Fiori e di Perle, and editor and translator of Gungi Vationgo's Smuovere il Centro. Her essays on white femininity and colonialism, African-Italian diasporic literature, and space and migration have appeared in a variety of edited collections and journals. Her book, Bianco e Nero, Storia dell'identità razziale degli italiani, is forthcoming for Le Monnier Mondadori in 2013. And now Caterina Romeo is assistant professor of gender studies at the University of Rome, La Sapienza. She holds a doctoral degree in women's and gender studies from that university, and also a second PhD in comparative literature from Rutgers University. She's the author of Narrative tra due sponde, Memoir di Italiane d'America, co-editor of a double monographic issue of Dialectical Anthropology on Contemporary Migrations in Europe, and a monographic issue of Tutte Storie on Italian-American women. She has translated into Italian Luis de Salvo's Vertigo and Kim Ragusa's The Skin Between Us, both recipients of prizes in Italy. She's currently completing a book on postcolonial women writers in contemporary Italy. Please join me in welcoming Cristina Lombardi-Diop and Caterina Romeo. So, Cristina Lombardi-Diop and Caterina Romeo. Cristina and Caterina will tell you a little bit now about the genesis of the book and some of the most important points. And then I'll have a few questions for them, and then we can open it up to your questions.
I will begin. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, very excited. Thank you for coming. This is a great occasion and a wonderful homecoming for me, and I'll explain it to you in a second. I want to thank Stefano Albertini of Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò for inviting us. I want to thank the Department of Italian Studies and Teresa Fiore for giving such a gracious, wonderful, enthusiastic presentation of this book. This is the second presentation of this book. We just presented it at Loyola University 2 days ago. We are excited. We are a little nervous. This is a project that actually took 3 years to complete. And I want to begin with something about personal encounters. First of all, this book has taken a toll on our lives, for sure. It's been intense, and I want to thank my son, who is here with me tonight, for his patience during the development of the book. This is also a book that actually did start as a personal encounter with Caterina Romeo. And Caterina and I met on the occasion of a conference organized by the John Felice Roma Center of Loyola University in 2009. And the conference title was The Changing Phase of the Mediterranean Migrant Women's Creativity and Constraints. And it was on that occasion that we began to talk about the need to fill a gap in academic studies on the changing phase of contemporary Italy, in light especially of global southern migrations, eastern migrations, contemporary diasporic literature and culture, and the legacy of Italian colonialism. So all of these themes really that were present at the 2009 conference actually came to our mind and came as pressing issues. Both Caterina and I share very similar trajectories. We both have a PhD in comparative literature. My alma mater is actually NYU, so this is my homecoming. We also have a very strong investment in women's studies, gender studies, and in critical race theory. So these disciplinary realms came together in our encounter. The book was born out of a need also to gather new interventions for both young and established scholars, and as well as scholars from both sides of the Atlantic, really. We realized that there was work out there done, but it had not really come together in a book. And so what I want to mention here is that, in fact, we actually created this book by inviting people to collaborate, but also by creating a call for papers. We had really many interesting proposals. The book was supposed to be much larger than it actually is. And we had to exclude some people, unfortunately. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about that. If you're curious, you can ask questions about it. But I want to mention that, in fact, there were some very young scholars, and there are one of them who is the author of Chapter 15 on Nollywood in Italy, Alessandro Jedlowski. He was still a graduate student when he actually collaborated with us. Also, the book was born with the idea of having original contributions. And we made an exception only for 2 articles. One is by Robert Young, that Teresa has already mentioned, He is a very established British post-colonial theorist. Some of you obviously know it. He's here at NYU. And then the other one is Sandro Mezzata's chapter, which is chapter number 2, which we translated from Italian. Let me tell you a little bit about the volume structure. Caterina will go more or less into the details, and you have the table of contents so that you can follow me. We have 4 parts, and each is dedicated to a set of issues. We have a part on European perspectives, another part of memories of colonialism, and the possibility of creating a shared identity. We have one section, this is a section we really wanted to have in the volume, on race and interracial interactions. And the very last section we are very proud of and very happy to have on post-national, transnational production. So the sections are thematically interrelated, but they're not grouped. Articles in each section are not grouped by media or by disciplines. And that was very important for us in terms of methodology. We did not want to territorialize and segregate literature from cinema, cinema from theory, political theory. We tried to actually, within the realm of our field of expertise, we wanted to have a dialogue across disciplines. And that's how the thematic sections came to be. The titles took quite a long time to decide. But, let me tell you a little bit about the methodology as I continue here. So what we thought we wanted to have, and we hope we succeeded in having, it's an idea of postcoloniality that actually is organized around temporal and spatial axes. Meaning that the postcoloniality that we understand in the case of Italy is not strictly temporal, and is not geographically determined. Meaning, first of all, there is no such a thing as a colonial moment and a post-colonial moment, and they are, in fact, only temporarily related. It seems to me that we wanted to emphasize a continuity. Because the book wanted to be on contemporary Italy, we definitely wanted to see what was the legacy of the past in the present, but we did not want to create a gap or a sort of a dichotomy between the past and the present. The other idea was that, in fact, in Italian postcoloniality, and this is important because it helps us understand how different the Italian case is from the British and French, postcoloniality is not necessarily linked to the presence of migrants who come directly from the ex-colonies. As you probably know very well, the majority of immigrants in Italy are now coming from other parts of the world, not necessarily from Ethiopia, Eritrea, the Horn of Africa, and Libya, which compelled us to think of Italian postcoloniality as an indirect postcoloniality. And what we meant by that is that migrants in Italy today, even if they don't come directly from the ex-colonies, nonetheless, they live in a condition that it is, in fact, post-colonial because of the legacy of colonialism. Now, so the geography of the book, and this was one of the questions that we actually had to debate with the blind reviewer, who actually thought that some of the articles on, for instance, Nigerians in Italy did not belong to the book. And we had to fight a little bit over this in order to make our understanding of postcoloniality as broad as possible. We do believe that the heterogeneity that is created by North Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, Latin American people, and Chinese and Southeastern Asians in Italy actually creates incredible possibilities and challenges to an idea of postcoloniality that in the case of Italy is informed neither by the colonial legacy of an assimilationist culture, such as was the case for France, not by the colonial legacy of an integrationalist culture, as is in the case of Britain. So what kind of post-coloniality did Italy produce? Well, we do believe that, in fact, the Italian post-coloniality is one where there seems to me a gap between institutional political spheres of applicability of multiculturalism and what is actually happening in the country. There is an incredible level of interactions among ethnicities within Italy and among Italians and the new Italians and foreigners. But it seems to me that at the institutional level, this is not necessarily recognized. And we wanted with this volume to make that visible. In fact, the idea of proximity and shared memories was very important for us, to sort of go beyond the dichotomy colonized and colonizer, which is very strong in the British paradigm, and to go beyond the idea of Francophonie as an extension of France all over the world. We wanted to look at the way in which, in fact, in Italian colonies, notwithstanding the racial law, notwithstanding implemented segregation and apartheid, what was happening in colonial society was a high level of interaction between Italians and the Eritreans and the Somalians. And this has been historically documented. Historians have done a tremendous work, and this book would not be possible without the work of people such as Angelo Del Boca, Nicola Labanca, Giulia Barrera, and Barbara Sorgoni, for instance, who have analyzed in details what was happening in the colonies at that time. So we knew that that work had been done, that the colonial archive had been opened. We also knew that Italian sociologists, and I think the first that comes to mind is Mannoni, but also Alessandro Dallago, had looked at contemporary Italy, and especially at racism in Italy, from a sociological perspective. What we wanted to do is to create a link between these two realms of exploration and investigation. And I hope we did give credit to people who came before us. So, the third aspect of the methodology has been already very nicely outlined by Teresa. It's the idea that, in fact, we cannot think of Italian postcoloniality without considering the history of immigration to the Americas and to North Africa, even before Italian colonialism. The historical period we are referring to is between 1890 and 1943, when Italy claimed colonial rights over Eritrea, Albania, Eritrea and Somalia, parts of Libya, Ethiopia, the Dodecanese Islands, and Albania. Now, this period also coincided with the mass immigration of Italians from Italy. One of the questions was, we want to understand how these phenomena are related, and we have many articles and many chapters that address this question. One of the most outstanding is actually Teresa Fiore's, which actually really placed itself within this conception of postcoloniality wonderfully, I believe. And I hope we'll have more time to discuss Teresa's article. But one of the questions was that when is this post-colonial beginning in Italy? And we realized that if we look at historical events, we cannot really pinpoint the exact ending of colonialism. We do know that Italy lost the colonies with the Paris Peace Treaty of 1947, but in a way Italy had already lost the colonies by military defeats by the British Army in East Africa in 1941 and in Libya in 1943. Then Italy, by the way, had a protectorate over Somalia for 10 years, from 1949 to 1959. And then again, the Italians remained in Libya until the 1970s. So the question is, when is this post-colonial moment beginning? And if you ask yourself few questions, you begin to reflect on the uneven development of such phenomenon historically. So I know that usually when we talk about colonialism, we refer to fascism, right? I think that that's what we all seem to know. But the colonial experience really started in liberal Italy and under the government of Francesco Crispi. And it really continued. It had ramifications all through the 20th century. And so the idea is that it still does have ramifications in the 21st century. I think that the other few concluding things I would like to say about the book is that the last part of the book really wants to see behind the historical perspective what is actually happening today in Italy. And one of the things that is happening today is the amazing cultural transformations that are affecting the country. There are new literatures, new cinematic perspectives, new documentary produced, new music, new culture produced by immigrants, by second-generation Italians, by black Italians. All of these wanted to be in the book, and we gave space to that. So in a sense, our attention was really on also giving voice to subjects that didn't seem to have much of a voice in academia, especially in Italianistica. One of the ways in which you can do that, and the way in which you can give voice to new cultural productions, is by adopting a cultural studies perspective, and that's certainly what the book does. And cultural studies, in fact, is something that has not done in Italy. It has not been done in academic. And it's very interesting because post-colonial studies could not exist without cultural studies. It is not by a chance that post-colonial, it's a British paradigm, because the British scholars were the ones who actually practiced cultural studies. Stuart Hall, of course, comes to mind. And so by breaking the boundaries between high and low culture, by breaking the ivory tower of Italianistica, we also wanted to, with this book, break the idea of Italian culture as elitist. We wanted to look at the way in which Italian culture is about who belongs and who does not belong to the Italian national family. So the post-colonial turn for us, in many ways, is also a different way of understanding who is Italian and who is not, and what it means to be Italian today. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight. I would also like to thank Stefano Albertini and Casa Italiana, the Department of Italian here at NYU, and Teresa Fiore for being here with us tonight and for giving us such a wonderful introduction. I also would like to thank Robert Viscusi, who was supposed to be here with us tonight, but actually he hurt his foot and was not able to actually make it out of bed, so he's not able to be here with us tonight. I will add a couple of things. Probably I will repeat also a couple of things since so much has been said already. What I would like to do here tonight is to contextualize a little bit the publication of our Postcolonial Italy, which I write PCI, as you see here still, within the field of postcolonial studies in Italy, which made its appearance relatively late at the end of the 1990s. And that happened mostly in departments of British English studies and American studies. A strong contribution to the dissemination of postcolonial studies in Italy also came through the work of the publishing house Meltemi. They published a number of postcolonial scholars in translations between the end of the 1990s and the 2005, let's say, scholars such as, well, the Holy Trinity of Postcolonial Studies, so Said Baba and Spivak, but also Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, Anilumba, and Robert Young, only to name a few. Through these publications, the focus was maintained on the British, on the postcolonial studies of the Anglophone world, so the British paradigm. So which in turn corroborated the idea that post-colonial studies is something out there that Italy is not concerned with. So it's something that does not involve in any way Italian culture and Italian society. So our volume starts from Cristina and my awareness that the theoretical framework developed in the British context does not translate to the Italian one, as also Teresa was saying, in line with the Said's notion of traveling theory. When you have a theoretical framework, you cannot just translate, that doesn't automatically translate to another context, to another geographical or historical context, but you have to find, you have to apply that framework, but also find the specificity of a different history and a different geography. So that is what we hope we do in the volume. So we want to, in this volume, we want to analyze if, how, and to what extent the traditional post-colonial framework works for Italy, and what specificities in terms of history, geography, time, and place must be considered in order to develop a specifically Italian post-colonial theoretical framework. So that one thing that is central for us is that this framework is a tool that provides us with different keys to read contemporary Italian society and culture, and as Cristina has already highlighted, contemporaneity is in fact the focus of this book, which they have already said that we are very interested in seeing how the present is connected to the past, but everything that is in the book is something that helps us, that gives us a contribution to analyze contemporary Italy. So, for example, when there were chapters that were submitted that were just concerned with colonial Italy, that were not included in the book, because we wanted to have something that helped us complete the puzzle a little bit of contemporary Italy. So this needed to be very central for us. So the specificity, as Cristina and Teresa have already highlighted, includes the post-colonial condition, the condition of subalternity of southern Italy, but also mass migrations to the Americas, to South America first and then to the United States in the second half of the 19th century, at the turn of the 20th century, colonialism, but also mass emigration towards Northern Europe after the Second World War, and internal migration. And also Italy's Mediterraneanness, so the connection, the central position of Italy in the Mediterranean, and strong connections with Africa, then and now, so even before colonialism, during colonialism, and in contemporary times. One thing that I think is worth highlighting here tonight is that, of course, the title is, I think, well, that was when we met at the conference 2009 and we thought about this project, we had our idea for the title was Postcolonial Italy, and it's still the title, because that was meant to be a statement. So the contemporary condition of Italy is a post-colonial condition. And that, I think, is something that we need to specify and we need to underline, because that is something that happens around in 2004, in fact. There are two volumes that come out that connect the condition of Italy to the word post-colonial, and that is a volume by Sandra Ponzanesi titled The Paradoxes of Post-Colonial Culture, in which she analyzes the work of some post-colonial British authors and some post-colonial Italian authors. And then Tiziana Morosetti's La letteratura postcoloniale italiana, which was a special a monographic issue of Quaderni del Novecento. Both these volumes come out in different places, one in Italy and one in the United States, in 2004. But there has been in the United States, also in Italy, a lot of talk about multiculturalism. In Italy, it's more interculturale, what is used more than multiculturale. And I think that these terms, multiculturalism, interculture, they conceal more than they reveal. What they reveal is the change in Italian society and the coexistence of native Italians with migrants and second and third generations. But what they conceal is what the reasons for these changes are, what the connections with the past is. So if we, for example, think about the discourse on race, as Cristina said, and we'll talk about that later, hopefully, the whole section that we have on race is not just on racism, but it's on the process of racialization and the construction of Italian whiteness and the denial of the intersection between Italianness and blackness. Now, if that study just considers the present condition without taking away the connections from the past, of course the analysis that we can have of the phenomenon of contemporary racism is is much shallower, and it's disconnected from what came before. If we don't think about, for example, if we don't make the connection with the racial laws, the racism of northerners towards southerners, for example, when we think of Italians like to think of themselves as being non-racist. So that's what Italians like to think. And while I was coming here, actually I was thinking also of this wonderful essay, which is probably the essay that I've used most in class in my life, which is Thomas Guglielmo's No Color Barrier, which is in this wonderful edited collection, Are Italians White? And his essay starts with this page in which he collects interviews with people in Chicago, old men in Chicago, who basically say, we made it by ourselves while African Americans received help from the government. And this is the story that has been handed down, while what Thomas Guglielmo claims is that an asset that African Americans didn't have is that the Italians were considered white while they weren't. And this, of course, constituted a series, resulted in a series of privileges. So that is also a form, in that volume there is a lot of there are a lot of essays about the racism of Italian Americans toward African American, for example. So Italians like to think of themselves as not being racist, but if you, of course, erase all this study, all this history, and see only the present condition, of course, the analysis is not thorough. I also wanted to say a little bit more about the sections. We can't go into the, as Cristina said, there are 18 chapters, one long introduction, 18 chapters, so we can't really go into much detail about the chapters, but I would like to tell you a little bit more about the sections. There are 4 sections. The first one is titled The European and Global Trajectories, and in this, what we do in this section, through the 4 chapters that we included, we reverse Dipesh Chakrabarty's provocative notion of provincializing Europe, suggesting a deprovincialization of Italy, which is enacted through the creation of affiliations with other post-colonial and global contexts, while at the same time looking diachronically at Italian history and culture as founded on phenomena such as transatlantic and trans-Mediterranean immigration, the racialization of Southern Italians, and contemporary immigration. In the second part, shared memories, contested proximities, this part engages categories of temporality and spatiality, not to suggest an archaeological approach to the colonial past and its official memorialization, but rather to examine how physical proximity produces shared memories. In the third section, which is the one on race, that is titled Intimations and Intimacies of Race, this section is devoted to the construction of race and the representation of whiteness and blackness in contemporary Italy, emphasizing the proximity rather than the separation of black and white subjects at present. And the last section, as Cristina was saying, we're very proud of this section, which is titled Post-National Aesthetics and Transcultural Production, explores music, cinema, literature, and youth culture produced by migrant and post-colonial subjects in terms of post-national aesthetics that transcends Italy's national borders and cultural models. I would like to close also, Teresa started with an anecdote, and I would also like to tell you one. There is something that happens very recently. Cristina and I are determined to see this book translated into Italian and published in Italy. And when I say I am determined, I also want to read the first line. I just thought about it, of this, of the acknowledgements. This book is the result of a fortunate encounter between two stubborn and determined women. So this is the result. So I'm pretty sure that this is also going to happen.
Southerners, by the way.
Calabresi. So of course.
We didn't know before we started.
It was just by chance, but anyway. So we have recently approached an Italian publisher, and of course I will not tell you the name of the publisher, because we want to have this book translated and published into Italian. Translated to Italian and published in Italy, and they have taken quite a long time to give to reply to us. And the chief we think that the chief editor who was in touch with us, we think that he was in favor of publishing the book, but what he told us is that they have decided against the publication of the book. And that is not the most interesting thing, I think, is the reason why they decided against it. He said something that we had to decipher a little bit, but what we understood was that the first part, especially the first section, would be acceptable. So the more theoretical one, if you look at the table of contents, what he says Italy is not ready for, or it's not coherent with the rest of their publication, is the case studies, what he calls the case studies. So, and he mentions two, and I think it's very interesting, which is the Nigerian production, so Nollywood, the production of Nigerian movies in northern Italy for the consumptions of African immigrants. And I think the second one was the youth culture one. So it seems to me that what happens here, now I have to say that about this, the most interesting question came from one of Cristina's students at Loyola University 2 days ago, because he came to me and said, but who is not ready? Because he said, we are not ready. He said, who exactly is not ready for that? Which I think is a very interesting question, because, of course, you know, some people are ready, one thing. Another thing is that if you're a publishing house, of course, you make it. It's not that people are born ready. You know, you make them ready, you know, by publishing things like that. But I think that what this tells us is that what is acceptable still is that we theorize about them, but then we're not ready to consider them as legitimate cultural producers of culture. So what they produce is not considered Italian, and it's not considered culture either. What Cristina was saying about cultural studies not being strong in Italy and, you know, post-colonial, in spite of, you know, the importance of Gramsci in both of them, but it's still very evident, I think, in Italian culture, where there is this whole notion of culture, you know, the divide between high culture and low culture is very much there. So this is not considered culture, and this is not even considered that much Italian. So again, I would like to close as Cristina did. This again is about who belongs to the family and who doesn't, and you know, what kind of idea of homogeneity we want to maintain, which instead needs to be, of course, very much questioned. Thank you.
course, I'm smiling because in the process of reading the book, I pulled out a few quotations that I think are really illuminating. I don't think we'll have the time to share those, but one that, of course, I've been thinking of is the one precisely from the essay on Nollywood, which is the Bollywood of Nigeria. And the author, Alessandro Jedlowski, shows how for Nigerians, Italy is a second-rate destination. So while Italy is actually coming up with all this, security package and anti-immigrant laws, from the perspective of Nigerians, if you end up in Italy, that's a failed migration project, and this is actually in the films. The person who ends up in Italy is ridiculed in these productions. So it's quite fascinating, and there are many moments in the book like this. Another one that comes to mind is Clarissa Clot. The other one on the on the butcher's board that we're not ready for, where she says that the descendants of Italian immigrants of the generation 2 is trying to show that they're Italians because they've been growing up in Italy, watching Japanese cartoons like Candy Candy, and listen to pop songs by Tiziana Rivale. And so fundamentally, as she says, I think quite brilliantly, to be Italian, one has to be well-versed in global pop culture. And so again, it's definitely a non-intuitive perception, but this is what the book in several instances, it's reminding us. So far from the colonizer-colonized paradigm, we're dealing with a much more heterogeneous scenario that obviously prompts us to engage the subject in different ways. And I think Caterina Romeo's provocative attempt to add the black to the tricolore, which is obviously a spin-off of Paul Gilroy's There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, is another way of forcing the paradigm and questioning this homogeneity. So I have a question for them. As you have listened, Italy constitutes a pretty unique case. That is to say, while other European countries were expanding their colonial territories, we were emigrating. While they were basically losing their colonies, we were in this gray area of decolonization and still a protectorate. While they were receiving immigrants, we were not there yet, and we've experienced this in a belated way. So we've been a little bit off, so to speak, all the way through. So my question is, the moment in which we include Italy in this post-colonial studies scenario, what is that we can contribute? Because I was reading an essay recently, and somebody said this idea of making Italy exceptional all the time, which is something that I've done in my work, for example, may run the risk of excluding Italy from the discourse, because we're so special that then nobody really includes us, right? So we may marginalize Italy the moment we're trying to include it. And yet I do feel like we can contribute something. And so for you who are constantly in contact with practitioners of post-colonial studies in the British, in the Francophone context, what is it that they're interested in? What is it that they're thinking can actually add a new perspective?
Thank you, Teresa. Good, interesting question. It gives me a chance to advertise for myself a little bit. But no, in 2 days I will be going to Yale University, where the French department, in the person of Christopher Miller, a very famous critic of Francophone African literature and culture, is organizing a conference entitled Beyond the French, African Literatures in New Languages. And people who are invited at this conference are scholars who actually are doing work on African literature written in Spanish, Dutch, German, Portuguese, Italian. So this seems to be very indicative of a future of post-colonial studies beyond French, beyond English, that in fact trying to understand global European citizenship from the perspective of diasporic cultural production in different languages that are actually undermined at the moment where the post-colonial seem to be dead. That's what we heard in what we know about the British paradigm of post-colonialism as a theoretical framework seems to have exhausted itself in many ways. It seems that the European diasporic subjects are actually revitalizing this term in order to investigate the very well forgotten histories of empire in Europe. And so it's very interesting that now the paradigm is moving away from Britain and away from the US in many ways, back to Europe, where perhaps it also belongs. And so Mireille Rosello, for instance, has spoken of a sort of trans-colonial production more than post-colonial productions. Some people, Christopher Miller himself, is looking back more at the history of slavery rather than the colonial moment as a sort of pivotal moment in the encounter between Europe and Africa, which is what seems to be happening in European post-colonial studies. I'm myself looking at the production of writers of Senegalese origin who are writing in Italian, and what is happening with their literary works is extremely fascinating, because they're writing in Italian, they write about contemporary Italy, they write about racism, they write about black Italians, but all their cultural references come from Francophone African traditions. And so what they're really doing, they're really reaching back to their own colonial legacy and to their strong anti-colonial legacy of struggles in order to react against what is a post-colonial condition in Italy. So I find all of this fascinating. I mean, these people, Sabrina Brancato, who will be at Yale, has written a book on Afro-Europe, where she looks at Spain, Portugal, and Italy in comparison. So it is, I think that it is there a future for this field where Italy will be. It is. People are extremely interested in Southern Europe because there are, in fact, similarities. And there's many similarities between France and Italy in particular, I would say. So.
A couple of things that I would like to add. First of all, in general, I think that I try to find, of course, when you use another paradigm, as we said, it needs to travel, it cannot just be translated, and that at least is what I tell my students all the time, to look at continuity and discontinuity at the same time. So, of course, to see how the situation of Italy is specific, what is specific in there, but also how it connects to other contexts, which is something that when Cristina was highlighting, was saying how the temporal and spatial axis is are very important in this book. This is something that we do in the book, is connect the present to the past, but also to connect Italy to other post-colonial conditions. And the European context, as Cristina was saying, is very important. There is the second or third chapter, Sandra Ponzanesi's chapter, which talks about the status of post-colonial studies, for example, in France, in the Netherlands, in Germany, or in Italy also, because of course we have to remember that post-colonial studies, of course, are very strongly connected to migrations, and the laws, migration laws in Europe are done in a way that, of course, has created a fortress of the whole. It's not just country by country, but it's the whole European Union that has created a sense of protection needed from migration. So, of course, this, the post-colonial framework that connects Italy to other countries in Europe deals with racism, as Cristina was saying, but also other issues like nationality, citizenship, circulation of labor, exploitation of workers, enclosure, borders. So there are a lot of issues that are in the discourse of postcoloniality that connects the politics of Italy to the politics of Europe, of Southern Europe in particular, but of Europe in general.
Thank you, and I'll ask another question, and then we'll open it up. I guess I'm thinking again of this very important nexus of emigration, colonialism, and immigration, which I happen to have addressed in my essay. But I was so pleased to see that it's really an important node for the whole book. That is to say, we cannot approach immigration without considering the contemporary colonial project. Keeping in mind, for example, that emigrant groups were called colonie from the perspective of Italy, both in the first wave of colonialism and during fascism. So we're dealing with a colonialism that in a way has two faces, and one of them we're calling emigrant colonialism now. We have the issue of immigration, which has been a bit late with respect to other countries, but at this point, Italy has 7.5% of immigrants, which is well above the European Union standards. So the scenario, again, is quite complicated because there are three pieces that interact with each other, and in a way they have to look at the same time. My personal interest has always been in this relationship between emigration and immigration, and thinking for a country that has had 26 million people living between 1876 and 1976. Even if you account for the 50% return rate, we're dealing with a demographic hemorrhage as it has been described. Where are the forms of empathy and solidarity today towards immigrants? Are they possible, or are we fantasizing about that? Because on the one hand, as Sandro Mezzadra is suggesting in his beautiful essay in the first part, we have the tools to rethink policies in non-racist ways in Italy because of this scenario. And yet, the essay right after that by Miguel Mellino tells us that Italy has become the vanguard of European racism. So we can go one way or another, and I wanted to even briefly hear from the co-editors about where we're going. Is this a possibility, or are we going to be, in a way, paradoxically trapped when I think it's a possibility.
Do you want to start?
Well, yeah, I wanted to say that historically, as we have seen in many other occasions, populations that have a history of marginalization then tend to marginalize rather than, well, that is not the only option, of course, but there have been many examples in which once a people starts going up the ladder, then you tend to distance yourself as much as you can from those who are instead new and who just started. So this is one of the possible outcomes of this. Is to some extent something that is happening in Italy, that has Italians, the memory, as we said, this is also a way to reconnect with the memory of colonialism and the memory of immigration. Immigration is also something that has not been talked about much until 10 years ago, I would say. So not only the historical phenomenon, but the cultural production of immigrants in other countries coming from Italy in other countries. So that is a past that needs to be recovered as much as colonialism. And I think that if on the one hand this is certainly something that is present in the Italian culture, so the forgetfulness about the past of emigration, and therefore the lack of solidarity, there is also a very lively cultural production, as we said, and which, of course, opens up to new ways of being and feeling Italian. Maybe Cristina wants to say something about that too.
Yeah, I would like to go back to Calabria. And I want to mention two things. One is dystopic and one is utopic. So I hope they're going to balance themselves dialectically. Okay, one is Rosarno, right? And what happened in Rosarno in 2009, 10, was the first race riots in Italy ever. Anybody who knows what happened in Rosarno in 2009? There was an episode that involved residents of this small agricultural center in Calabria, where the economy is actually geared around the harvesting of citrus, oranges especially, and tomatoes. Between Rosarnesi and African immigrants who actually do the kind of work that Southern Italians did until the 1950s, until they actually abandoned these lands to migrate to Milan and Genova and Turin. So what we have there, it's a clash between the ex-exploited and the new exploited. Right? So the new immigrant laborers of Italy and the ex-laborers, agricultural laborers of Italy. And there, I think you really see this short circuit between immigration and internal colonialism that really came explosively together. They were clashed and riots, and they actually resulted in the sort of exile of the African migrants away from Rosarno, deported really on police buses back to the capital. And the other example is Badolato. And Badolato is also a small town in Italy where there has been one of the most interesting social experiments in hospitality in Europe. There, a community of Kurds refugees were hosted by this very small town, and they were given housing, and they were extremely well welcomed by the population. And unfortunately, I have to say that we did have an article on this social experiment on Badolato from the perspective of the concept of hospitality in our collection that we had to take out. But Badolato is considered by many sociologists and many ethnographers and anthropologists a very interesting case of collaboration and solidarity between Southern Italians and refugees. So I do think that in fact Italy non si smentisce mai, meaning that we are a country of contradictions. This seems a platitude, but I think it's very much still the case when we speak of it, postcoloniality. And the other thing is, I think that we need to consider how important mobility has been in the history of this country. How, in fact, fluxes and movements of people have determined movement of capital and labor, but also movement of cultural trends. Until I think we don't understand that Italianità can be a transnational concept, until we do not accept, in fact, that in fact Italianità has always decentered itself in many ways. I would say since antiquity. I don't want to say something trans-historically generic, but I mean, you know, we need to have that sort of longue durée. We want to see the future. I think that the future leaves some room for optimism. As I said, I think that's the civic society, what Gramsci had understood has been, in fact, one of the backbones of Italian anti-hegemonic trends. It's ready for a change, and it's doing it. But I do think that the institutions have not yet followed. And I think that civic society, and all of us, I mean, you know, especially those of us who have a privilege to have a forum, academics don't have such a large forum, but you know, cultural operators, journalists, teachers, they all involved. Publishing houses, yes, can also can all make a change, and they are making it. They are making it. So
we are ready.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Okay, why don't we open it up to your questions and comments? Yes.
I wonder if you could elaborate on what you mean by Italy's internal colonialism, known as the Southern question. In other words, I think of colonialism as a power going into another place. So could you explain that a little bit? Yeah. What that means?
Maybe. Yeah.
Well, whatever.
Yeah. Of course. Has everybody heard the question?
The Southern question is historically defined as the problem of the South. The south of Italy is considered all the territories that were included in the national unity, or at least part of the Kingdom of Savoy, which then became the Italian kingdom in the period 1860, 1870. By many historians, I'm thinking of Patriarca as being one of the persons who best described this phenomenon, has been considered as a colonial annexation. It was done by a military action. It was done with more or less little consensus from the population. It actually had lingering issues, one of which was in fact a disconnect between, a continuous disconnect culturally and politically between the northern part of Italy, which is industrialized, and the southern part of Italy, which is less developed economically. So that's what we mean by internal colonialism.
So it's a historical reference, you're saying, because Southern Italy was part of the Savoy family?
No, Southern Italy was actually incorporated within the larger kingdom of Italy by the Savoy in this through the Risorgimento period.
But wasn't, okay, but the Risorgimento, all of Italy was pieces in a way of different kingdoms or histories, so in a way all of Italy was put together from different...
Not exactly, okay. Not exactly, because the motor, the political motor of the unification was Piedmont and the Piedmont elites.
Okay, so Piedmont considered that in the south was sort of annexed. It wasn't part of the
original. Right. They did not say it that way. We also have to consider that after unification, a very large part of the cultural intelligentsia began to produce a fairly influential corpus of literature on the southern Italians as ethnically, biologically different from the northerners. And there's tons of documentation on this. There's, anthropologists and ethnographers and political theorists began to reason about how northern Italians belong to the more European Aryan race, while southern Italians belong to the Euro-African race. So there has been, besides the technical, political, military actions of this particular process of unification, there has been ramification in Italian political theory about the inferiority of southern Italians.
Which, by the way, let me add the interesting part, which is also in the book, is that these theories, such as that of Niceforo, for example, were then exported to the United States and used at Ellis Island, where Italians actually came as immigrants from this perspective, and they were racialized fundamentally, right, and categorized. So they were considered a southern race altogether, even though, as Thomas Guglielmo reminds us, they were white on arrival. So they were white, but they were of southern race. Different categories from the ones that we think of today, but it's the same matrix in terms of theory and anthropological reading.
White of a different color, as
or white of a different color, exactly. Yeah. Gianfranco.
Yes, I wonder whether you can elaborate a bit about this parallel between colonization and emigration, and what were the policies, the conscious, the rationale from the government of Crispi on, when there were these millions of people who were leaving Italy, but there was also an effort to acquire colonies. And if you can tell us a little bit more of the economic factors, either of you who wants to comment on this?
Economic factors, yeah. Well, many historians think that Italian colonialism that began more or less with the acquisition of a little bay on the Red Sea and then developed eventually with the consolidation of the Colonia de Primogenia, which was Eritrea in 1890, was a completely flop from an economic point of view. So historians have asked themselves, why did we do it? Why did Crispi and the establishment, liberal establishment, embark in a fairly expensive endeavor? And their answer was prestige. This is the vulgata, and this, I guess, fairly good consensus on that. So one of the questions, and this comes up very nicely in Teresa's article, but also in Roberto De Roberti's articles on Cristo si è fermato deboli, is that in fact sending peasants to the Horn of Africa rather than sending them to the Americas, we do know the mobility of people was highly regulated even then by the government and restricted in many ways. Mussolini was the one who actually began to control the flux of Italians and how they moved and how much, to what extent, was considered in fact one of the ways in which national prestige was preserved. So Italians would not go to the Americans and pave roads, but would actually go and pave the roads to create a colonial empire. So, I mean, manifestly and politically, it seems the solution of colonization of Africans seems a much better solution. And so there were constant overlaps between this idea of colonia, the colonia that was in fact an action of occupation of territories, and actually reappropriation of quarta sponda, romanità. This was especially the case with Libya, which actually occurred during the liberal period 1911, 1912. And the idea that instead immigration was considered an hemorrhagia, in fact, of populations, right? A depleting of the blood and depleting of the resources of the nation, right? So in many sense, I think that the two things balance them out quite nicely. Very interesting, this is certainly Viscusi talks a lot about that, but also Pasquale Verdicchio, who have discussed the way in which nationalist literature, for instance, began to exploit rhetorically the advantages of colonialism in order to, in fact, talk against immigration. So the two, rhetorically and politically, the two events actually connected very nicely. Luigi Einaudi was one of the most unflinching supporter of such connections and the balancing out of the two phenomena. I hope this answers your question.
No, yeah, I just wanted to add a little thing. She just said that Viscusi also writes on this, and we refer to this article because he reformulates the notion of post-colonial, referring to the Italian migration to Italy, and he was to the United States. I'm sorry, and he uses. He said that this is articulated on the around the dichotomy metropole periphery, but he defines the post-colonial condition, the post-colonial condition of Italian immigrants in the United States as subaltern both towards the metropole, which is represented by Italy and by mainstream culture here. So he uses the very terminology of post-colonial studies to instead refer to emigration. So this is another way, according to me, that the two discourses really intersect and connect.
Yes. Yeah, listening to this very interesting presentation, I was wondering if modern post-colonial as another concept might help understand what's going on in Italy. And I refer to an essay I would really like
by Patrick Chamoiseau and others called The Lord de la Criolité. I don't know if you, it was the late 90s, and I was covering this for the French newspaper, this talk and La Maison Française, and then we went out for drinks and had a really wonderful conversation, and he told me, well, you know, the whole world is Creole, only we know it to be from Martinique, you know, so this is the specific elaboration of these writers in the Martinique do. So just because when you were talking about it, I was thinking about that when you're talking about the Senegalese writers that have different references, so there's no metropole or
Yes, absolutely. I would like to take on this is an interesting question. Well, Creolité is a concept that was born by, in fact, coined by Glisson, which is a Martinican, a Caribbean theorist, and it's extremely useful, especially to describe the Lusophone colonial and post-colonial context, and partially the Caribbean, where actually people intermingled highly. And this is something I said in my presentation also happens in Italian colonies. The problem is that we don't have such a concept as Creole. I mean, we do have words that are tainted by racial violence. And one is meticciato, and the other one is mulatto. And unfortunately, really, I mean, it seems like a postmodern fixation, but I think the language is very important. And I think that if you look at Italy and this kind of hybridization is also a term that I find very problematic because it's a eugenic, racialist term, as in terms of meticciato, as a lot of actually young Italians are doing right now. It seems to me, oh, we're doing something meticcio, let's do something meticcio. It's problematic because, in fact, the racial laws at one point really targeted interracial children, and heavily so, considering them sick, considering them carrier of violence. And, you know, there were leggi contro I meticci, were called le leggi del meticciato. So I'm doubtful about, in fact, I think Creolité would be very nice. One term that Sheikh Tidjane Gueye, who is a Senegalese writer who writes in Italian, likes to use the term synthesis. Well, yes, synthesis or synergia. That is a term that he takes from Senghor, in order to describe more of this kind of creolization of Italy. And I do think that we need to be a little bit more creative, and I think creolizzazione is a term that I would actually like.
I wasn't suggesting to use the same word,
Yeah.
maybe come up with something else, but just the concept.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is actually quite obvious when you read the book in some essays, especially those about cinema. I was very surprised because obviously this has been a very close studies. I bimbi meticci, the children born from mixed couples, do not appear on Italian cinema. And when they do, it's an exceptional case. And so that goes to show how obviously there's still much resistance to the visual and the verbal representation, although Creole would be obviously a beautiful horizon.
I have a little personal anecdote. I have to share this with you. When I was living in Italy with my family, I have two kids who are mixed. One is there, she's sleeping right now. He's not interested. We were actually called by Cristina Comencini, who was casting people for roles in her film, Bianco e Nero. Have you seen that film? Which is one of the few films that actually films the encounter between an Italian and an African woman, an Italian man, white man, and a black African. But it was so interesting because, in fact, my kids were definitely too light-skinned. So there's a sense in which they couldn't really be cast because it wasn't really the case. I mean, okay, they're in country, but she has kids with another African, so I guess they haven't really yet produced any progeny. So I guess it was very interesting for me because I do think that, in fact, that there's many mixed kids in Italy and there were many black Italians. I would like maybe Loretta to intervene here because she's a...
A lot of Black Italians that now actually live here in the US also because it's really difficult to live in Italy as a Black Italian and a mixed family.
Right. I mean, yes, we have to bring our own personal into this political. I have to say that it isn't easy. That is one of the reasons why I left in 2008. It is not easy to be married to an African man. It's not easy to have Black Italian kids.
I just wanted to add something when Teresa was referring to the movies when mixed children don't appear. Both Onio Healy and Rosanna Caponetto in the section of race, they have a number of cases in which there are mixed couples, but there is some miscarriage or abortion, so kids actually don't materialize. They are still, yeah, they are not quite, we're not ready yet, again.
Anything else?
This is just a suggestion, actually. I was just thinking how enjoyable it would be to write an additional chapter about the publishing, Italian publishing experience and resubmit it. Just for fun.
You know, the thing is, we had, well, of course, I mean, this would be wonderful, but the book already included 22 chapters. Cristina was saying that we had to actually exclude some chapters, the one about Baudelaire, but another 3 that were excellent chapters, also very interesting. Because then, you know, you always have to deal with the reality of publishing houses and how many pages, and we had to bargain because they wanted so many words and we wanted many more, so maybe 100, 10,000 more, 10,000 less. So it's actually very difficult to have control over the final outcome.
But I do want to give you good news. I mean, first of all, Palgrave, we want to thank them.
Yes.
As part of all, yes, because they actually graciously, I mean, I think Stan Pugliese did a wonderful job. This is a great collection. The book is actually coming in paperback in September. This is one of the things that we wanted in the contract, and actually, you know, Palgrave does not give paperbacks easily, but I assumed that the book would go well, and now it's extremely expensive, so don't buy it now.
Or
but wait until September, possibly adopt it for your courses, for you know, I mean, it will be available. It's available in many libraries nowadays, but really to buy it, it's terrible, and we don't recommend to buy it now. But this is a great idea, perhaps in a new introduction to the paperback. We could add that chapter, yeah.
You're not a good promoter in your book.
They're not here.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Thank you so much for such a rich presentation filled with lots of specificity, and I especially loved some of the cultural productions that you talked about from both West Africa and East Africa. And I'm curious to know your experiences with Libya. I mean, I know that you've covered Libyan Italian cultural productions, and I just don't know anything about it. And are there some examples that you can share, especially given you know, the recent history of Libya? And
actually, the only example I can think of is Luciana Capretti's Ghibli. Luciana Capretti is the equivalent, I would say, of Erminia dell'Oro, but in Libya, meaning that she's an Italian who was born in Libya, I think, and she was sent out of Libya in 1970, and she wrote this novel that is called Ghibli, in which she tells the story of Italian colonization and of when the Italians were chased out of Libya. But that is in fact the only example I can think of.
There's no other No other than to our knowledge. The archives, the Libyan archives opened in this collaboration between the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Interior in Libya. Before the war, they started, Berlusconi actually established that as one of the trade agreements with Libya and Gaddafi, to actually have Italian historians finally accessing the Libyan archives. And a lot of historical stuff is coming up, especially oral history of the extermination of the Libyan resistance in Cyrenaica in 1931-34, stories and songs that have now been translated into English, because some of these scholars are in fact in the United States. You know, they're trying to write that history through an analysis of poetic production in Arabic. But in terms of like Libyan immigrants in Italian, nothing.
But also, I'm thinking of The Lion of the Desert. That was this movie that was shot in 1989, was it? 84. And that was not shown in Italy until I think 2 years ago. So there seems to be a lot of censorship on the whole issue.
Okay, I guess maybe we can continue the conversation. Oh, there was Alessandra. Okay.
I was thinking about everything you say. This post-colonial Italy, it's something that made me think that maybe Italy was as a specific case, because, you know, like thinking what is specifically post-colonial in Italy, it's also the history of Italy itself. If you think about the late unification, and you know, it's really hard to see what it means to be a new Italians when we don't know what it means to be Italian. And I think that if you think also from a political perspective, the phenomenon of Lega, for example, all that kind of rhetoric, and this lacking of a strong identity, which I think racism comes a lot from that. And also, another link to immigration, for example, it's really, particularly the way that Italy treats in its history immigrants. Like, for many aspects, from a political perspective, for example, they can become citizens, and the Italians that are there today cannot become citizens, and that's absurd. But at the same time, Italy never recognized the Italian American, for example, as really Italian. And and also if you think how Italian American define themselves, many times, especially people from Sicily, they're Sicilian American, they're not Italian American. So I think that post-colonial can be also used to rethink about the history of Italy as a post-colonial country in terms of
I hope that's what we do. I mean, this is the ambition. This is actually the ambitious project behind the volume. I hope that we have succeeded in conveying this very idea. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you will find that in many articles of the book. And thank you for bringing up some of these other issues, such as the Northern League, for example.
Yeah,
yes. This is a very lively conversation, but I wonder whether it's time to go. Please approach us, after. Thank you very much for your participation, and thank you to the co-editors of the book.